You know what, could I have you,
Am I in the front?
no, you're not, but.
Am I casting a
Could I have
shadow?
you sit over here a little bit so he'll be looking closer to the camera?
Yes.
And too far off.
You're not getting a shadow on me, are you?
That's
No.
great.
Okay.
We don't want to get his profile all day. It's yours.
Can you state your name?
My name is Carlton S. Miller. I live in Massachusetts, just barely, because we just moved from New Hampshire 3 or 4 weeks ago. But we live in Pioneer Valley in Amherst, and it's made the transition from New Hampshire relatively easy because the Pioneer Valley of Massachusetts is such a beautiful, beautiful place.
Absolutely. Good sound check? Okay. Carlton, welcome. Mr. Miller, can you tell us a little bit about growing up in New Hampshire, where you grew up and how you came to love the mountains the way you do?
Oh, I'd love to. That's one of my favorite topics. The fact is, however, that I was born and brought up in the Bronx, because my father was professor of physics at New York University. It was his first professorship, and we lived there until I was born on May 7th. And on that day, he landed his job in Brown University. And inside of 2 weeks, we had moved from the Bronx, fortunately, up to spend the first summer in Guilford, New Hampshire. And we did that every year from then on, all during my early childhood, spending our summers up there in New Hampshire, and occasionally getting up in the winter. As I grew older, we took advantage of the skiing that New Hampshire offered even in those early days. And I started skiing first in the winter of 1930 and 31, I believe. It's a long time ago. Unfortunately, my proficiency isn't matched by the duration that I've been skiing.
Now,
But I'm still a fair skier, or was.
Did you ski at, what was it, Peck's on Sugar Hill? Hackett's.
I'm sorry?
Where in New Hampshire did you
Oh,
begin skiing?
we skied, in those early days, we skied principally in the Waterville Valley, which in those days was nothing like what it is today. It was all cross country through beautiful old logging roads, but there were no lifts at all. We had to hike in very cold weather sometimes. I saw it as low as 26 below in Waterville, and we went out and skied in it. So I think that was probably the best training that I ever could have had for getting interested in and starting in the 10th Mountain Division.
Now, you were attending Phillips Exeter Academy.
Phillips Andover.
Andover, rather. Phillips Andover Academy. And had applied to Harvard.
That's correct. I had applied to Harvard, and I had passed the Harvard entrance examinations, and all that I need to do was to, in fact, graduate from Phillips. Well, as it turned out, I flunked my final examination in American history, and they wouldn't graduate me until I took a makeup exam. And I took the makeup exam a few weeks later and proceeded to flunk it. And so they said, all right, you can take another makeup examination if you want, but you can't do it for, I think, 2 or 3 weeks. I've forgotten what it was. Well, I went back and I memorized every bit of American history that ever existed, and passed the final examination, got my diploma from Andover, got my entrance to Harvard, and went down to the local board and told them, grab me now. And I did. I had already received got the 10 letters of recommendation and expected to get accepted in the 10th Mountain Division.
Now, do you remember who wrote you your letters of recommendation for the 10th?
Sure. One was David Austin II, who was the proprietor of the Waterville Inn. My father was one, although I think that the rules of the game stated that it couldn't be a relative, but it was. The third person I don't remember.
This is after Pearl Harbor, is that correct?
Yeah, this was well after.
What made you want to enlist?
Well, I wanted to get away from academic life. that was the fact of the matter. And I just saw the war going on, and I wanted to be part of it. And in particular, with an opportunity to join the 10th Mountain Division, or the ski troops, as it was called, I thought that was great. You see, we had all been subjected to the propaganda films produced by Finland, describing and showing pictures of the Finnish ski troops.
Had you ever been out west before?
I had never been west, to my knowledge, west of Springfield, Massachusetts.
So what route did you take after you received your acceptance to the 10th? How did you get out to Camp Hale?
Well, I reported to Fort Devens, Massachusetts, and spent only about 3 or 4 days there at Fort Devens, waiting for the call to go to Camp Hale. But there was no assurance that this is where I was going to go. They didn't tell us in so many words that, yes, you're going to Camp Hale. You had to wait till the day of your departure before you knew what it was. And, but sure enough, we had a train ride from Fort Devens through Chicago on the Eastern States Special to Chicago. And then we changed to the Rock Island Rocket to go from Chicago to Colorado Springs, where I got my first glimpse of the Rockies. And it was just an incredible sight. I just fell in love with it right off. Then we got on to buses and a bus and headed for Camp Hale. Well, I began to worry right off because I noticed that everybody else, either in this group, ski troops, or headed for the ski troops, was twice my size. I was the shrimp of the outfit, so far as I could see, and this was troublesome to me.
How so?
Well, I just wondered whether I could cut it. Anyway, let me go on ahead. I duly arrived at Camp Hale and was assigned to the recruit school, which was basic training. And I was looking forward to it until I found out precisely what you had to do first. Seems that the lieutenant who was in charge of our group would get us out onto the drill field, all lined up, and then he would start at one end of the line and he'd look at the first man and said, "What's your name, soldier? What's your serial number, soldier?" Well, it seems that I was a stutterer, and I was a bad stutterer. And when you're nervous, you stutter even worse. And as the lieutenant came down the line, perspiration began to come out of my forehead, and I was just frightened to death. And anyway, he, without any expression on his face, he stopped right in front of me, looked me in the eye. "What's your name, soldier?" And I started in, "Carlton Miller, sir." "What's your serial number, soldier?" 31386-984, sir. Not a smile on his face, no expression at all. And he went on to the next man. We went ahead the rest of the day and did what we were doing in the training. Next day we filed out on the drill field again and started the same thing all over again. And what's your name, soldier? What's your serial number, soldier? And finally he came to me, stared me in the eye without an expression. How are you today, Miller? And went on to the next man. I could have followed him to the ends of the earth.
Who was that?
You know, I don't know. I don't know.
Interesting. What month was that?
That was August.
So you arrived in warm weather.
That's correct. It was warm weather even up there at Camp Hale.
So what was it like, that first taste of winter?
The first,
taste of winter that you got in the Rockies?
oh, I don't know. That's just a shade ahead of the story. As soon as I got to a weekend, I headed up into the mountains on my own. I just loved it. The whole environment was just precisely what I had imagined. And so it was my custom to go out on weekends, even during the summer and the fall. But each weekend I would climb higher and I'd get a sample of winter in a way. But when winter really came, that was something else again.
Now, where in particular were you climbing? Was that homestake, or was that the surrounding areas you
Well,
climb at?
I climbed a little in the homestake region, but we also went out and I climbed Mount Massive, which is the one right next to Mount Elbert, just out of Leadville. And
How did you do with the altitude? Was there an adjustment period?
the altitude never bothered me at all. Oh, it made me huff and puff, but I was relatively fortunate.
What about the Pando hack?
Yes, we had the Pando hack, but the fact of the matter was that the coal smoke, the bituminous coal smoke, I liked the smell of it. I just associated that smell with Camp Hale and with Colorado. It permeated the whole state. It wasn't just Camp Hale, but I loved the smell of it. To this day, on occasion when I'm traveling out there, I'll get a whiff of it, and oh, it'll take me right back.
Now, when you think about Camp Hale, when you close your eyes, what do you see?
I see a lot of days out on the drill field. I see mostly the mountains surrounding it, and the daily hiking maneuvers that we carried on. And for the most part, all of my memories of Camp Hale are good memories. This distinguishes me, in fact, from many of my colleagues who did not like it so well.
Can you elaborate a little bit on what were the best experiences that you had at Hale, or the funniest?
Oh my, I think the best experiences that I had were when we would take off on maneuvers. We'd go out up into the boondocks outside of the camp. We'd bivouac overnight. This was a new experience to me. We'd curl up in our sleeping bags. When in the winter the temperature would go down to 30, as much as 40 below zero. We'd just have no tent. Tents were too heavy to carry, so we'd just dig a little hole in the snow, lay the sleeping bag down in it, and go to sleep. Of course, you had to draw guard duty, which meant that you had to get up a couple of times during the night and introduce yourself to that 40 below weather. We also, of course, had to learn how to survive in that. We'd take off much of our clothes and stuff them inside the sleeping bag. Our boots, all iced up and all, would go into the bottom of the sleeping bag, or the bottom of the sleeping bag, yes, so that they wouldn't freeze. If they froze, no way you were going to get them on in the morning.
Now, you talked about that you were worried that you were too small when you got on the bus to Hale.
Well, fortunately that disappeared due to a certain peculiar set of circumstances. One of the things we finally did on that recruit school was to practice with the M1 rifle. I had never held a firearm in my hands before in my life. And when we went out for some practice on the first day, rifle practice, I made the fatal mistake of getting my knuckle up against my eye, or so that when the rifle kicked back, it bruised my cheek. And I went back into barracks that night with this big shiner, and sort of, again, accentuating the idea that here was a shrimp who was maybe a little on the sad sack side. At least this was the image that I began to get of myself. About a week later, we went out to the rifle range and we shot for record. And there were roughly 180 men that shot for record that day. And I got the second highest score of that 180 men and became an expert on the M1 rifle. If I had had any inferiority complex up to that time, it vanished.
You must have been feeling very strong.
I was. Actually, I found that the size didn't matter. I know when we took off on maneuvers in Camp Hale in March of 1946, was that right? No.
44.
Yeah, 44. They weighed the pack that I carried. And I can't imagine carrying it. It weighed 104 pounds, including the rifle and a tent and all. 104 pounds.
How much did you weigh?
I weighed 119 pounds. And we took off on maneuvers, and it was not just walking up the road. It was going off into the boondocks, sinking up to your hips in soft snow, swimming at times through the snow. I just don't know now how I did it.
Clearly, that made an impression on you for the rest of your life.
Oh, it did. It did.
Being able to.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
And of course, that came in handy in climbing later.
Yeah.
You participated in D series. Is that the reference that you're making?
I'm sorry.
The D series maneuvers in early 1944, when you were outside for 3 weeks, 4 weeks at a
Yeah,
time.
on maneuvers.
What was that like?
That was a bad scene for me, because on the first week we were out was all right. It went to 40 below, the coldest that any of us had ever seen up there, and but survived perfectly all right. The following week, however, we went up into the area of Vale Pass, and it's a beautiful day. We hiked up, skied up to about the 13,000 foot mark, and then skied down, started down, just as the sun disappeared. And as soon as the sun disappeared, the soft corn snow of the spring froze over. Now, I didn't have 100 pounds on my back at that time, but I surely had 50 pounds on my back. That included the rifle slung on the pack. Well, I went down into the first turn, and the tips of one of my skis caught in the crust, and I pitched forward, the worst possible fall that you can take, and landed head first. Apparently it knocked me out, and when I came to, a minute or two later, I judge, a crowd of guys were around me. "You okay, Miller? You okay?" And I said, "Yeah, I guess so." But I went to stand up, and I realized I couldn't. And from what little I knew, I looked as though I had broken my ankle, my right ankle. And they improvised a toboggan out of snowshoes. I broke my ankle up around 12,000 feet. And they took me down on an improvised snowshoe toboggan, then transferred me over to a regular toboggan, then over to one of the snowcats, and finally out to the road, where an ambulance picked me up, took me up to Camp Hale Hospital, where I arrived at 2 o'clock in the morning. And the officer who was on duty was absolutely incensed to think that he had to disturb his sleep for poor little me at 2 o'clock in the morning. He looked at me and says, "What's wrong with you, soldier?" And in a meek voice I answered, "Well, I think I broke my ankle." "Huh, broke your ankle? Nothing. You guys out in the field don't work hard enough to break anything." And with that, he took the blanket that was on me and whipped it off like that. And I guess took my foot with it. And he looked at it, and no exaggeration, the ankle, the foot, was turned almost 180 degrees out of phase. And guess you did break it after all. Well, they waited about 10 days, I guess, until some of the swelling went down. And then they set it under full-time fluoroscopy, something which I guess is never done now. And they did an absolutely perfect job, set that ankle. And for 6 weeks I hobbled around in the hospital. And then at this time, at the very end of it, the 10th Mounted Division moved out of Camp Hale to Camp Swift, Texas. And I was stranded there in this hospital and in a reconditioning school, as they called it. I was beside myself. My heart and soul was in the 10th Mounted Division and everything that the 10th Mounted Division did. And so I figured, well, I hasten the recovery if I start exercising. And the very day that they took my cast off, I sneaked out of the hospital and I walked partly up Resolution Creek. Well, as luck would have it, the officer, the man who set my ankle, came by in a car. Apparently he recognized me and slowed down, went up a ways, came around, turned around slowly and examined me very carefully and went on, didn't say anything. Next day, he came up on his rounds and he said, "You take it easy, Miller." And that's all he said. So almost every day I would go out for an hour or so walk. And then I had eventually to take a test to get out of the reconditioning school. And this test consisted of walking a mile or two, running 100 yards, running with somebody on your back, and certain things like that. I could not do it all, but of equal value in the test was your ability to do push-ups and chins and that sort of thing. And I could do more sit-ups and chins than anybody they'd ever seen before. And they graduated me from the, even though I couldn't really properly walk. Sent me down to Camp Swift, Texas. First day I got down there, they sent us out on hike, forced march in the full sun. And guys were dropping out like flies from heat exhaustion. But heat exhaustion never bothered me, but my ankle began to pain, and so I finally fell down, feigned heat exhaustion, fell down at the side of the road. And the ambulance came, picked me up, took me into the hospital, fed me on salt water for 3 days, sent me back to the company. I soon got over the pain in the ankle. Actually, I went on furlough, and my father said, "You go to an osteopath, he'll fix you up." And he did.
Now, were you dating anyone at the time?
Dating?
Yes.
No.
Okay.
I was frightened to death of girls.
So you were a bachelor at Hale and at Camp Swift. It sounds as though you had some mixed experiences with officers during training. Would you say that the officers, for the most part, during the training phase, were good, or did you have complaints?
Oh, I think the officers were very good in the training. I had a bad time with our company commander at Camp Swift, Captain Obermeyer. And as a matter of fact, he eventually showed his true colors. The first day we were in combat, he was nicked by a piece of shrapnel or something, just a little skin thing on it. And he took off without assigning anybody in his position. And he was subsequently court-martialed and assigned to the so-called 90 Deuce Division, and which in those days they considered was the worst possible punishment that
was the
a regular officer could.
The Black Division.
Yeah.
When General Hayes came on board down at Swift, were you aware of a change in the attitude of the division?
Oh, yes, I think so. We were all totally demoralized by going down to Camp Swift. The fact that we no longer had the mountains, the whole TO had been changed. We had 12-man squads instead of 9-man squads, and the whole atmosphere had changed. But when Hayes came in, and when Mark Clark apparently had agreed that, gee, he'd love to have the 10th Mounted Division help him in Italy, whereas President Eisenhower, General Eisenhower at that time, didn't like the idea of taking us on because we had had no experience working in close support of tanks and armored vehicles.
You did not go to Kiska, but was there any kind of residual concerns over what had happened to the 10th with friendly fire up at Kiska with the 87th Regiment?
No, we never heard very much about what happened to the 87th. Either that or we didn't listen. I don't know. It was furthest from our thoughts. We were concerned about what was going to happen to us.
Now, what company were you assigned to at this point?
I was in B Company of the 85th.
Would you say that most of the guys that you were with wanted to get into combat? Or was there a feeling that you would be just fine staying stateside?
No, I think, well, I don't know. Some of us were anxious to. I was, for example, because I didn't have enough sense not to. But there were those who were perfectly willing and accepted it, and there were those who were totally frightened to death of it, the idea. But they were in a minority.
Now, your orders came through, and they trained you across the country to Hampton Roads, Virginia. Is that right?
Say that?
You went by train.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Yes. We went down to Newport News, I've forgotten where it was, and embarked on what had been the SS America, the largest passenger steamer going at that time, and it was rechristened the SS America. It was made into a troop ship. And
what were the conditions on board?
oh God, they're awful. The bunks were 5 deep, with just enough space for your head. And heaven knows whatever would have happened if the boat had been hit. But it went so fast that it was less likely that the submarine would get it. And we zigzagged all the way across and contributed to my seasickness. I was deathly seasick all the way until we got into the Straits of Gibraltar. then it calmed down, and of course I was very much interested in seeing the Straits of Gibraltar and the Mediterranean, and I was fine after that.
Now, when you arrived in Italy, it was right after Christmas, 1944. What was the first thing that you did when they reconstituted the 85th in Italy? What were you assigned to do?
When they reconstituted?
Well, when they
Well,
got you all together in the training
it
area.
depended entirely upon what platoon you were with. Our platoon was fortunate, and we were assigned on what they called a half-track patrol in the little town of Shesta, which ran between Bagno di Lucca in the south and a little hill town up beyond Shesta. I've forgotten the name of it. And we would run the half-track patrol with quad 50s on the back. And if you could drive a half-track, you would share the driving with the other guy, and he'd go on the back. But it was no fun being on the back. It was cold. And furthermore, it was just no fun sitting up there all the time.
What was your reaction to seeing Europe and Italy for the first time and seeing the mountains there? The Apennines and...
Well, you couldn't, from Shesta, you couldn't, well, you could see the lower part of it. You didn't get any big, broad perspective on it. See, I had spent some time in Italy when I was a child, and so I had some idea of what it was like.
When did you go on the line? When did they bring you up?
When we actually go into, well, I've forgotten the dates. I'm not a good historian from that standpoint, but they started in the offensive with Belvedere and Gorgolesco. We were actually assigned to attack Gorgolesco, which was a peak adjacent to Belvedere. And it was a very hairy experience. The intelligence information was that it was held by just a very lightly defended force, the Germans. As it turned out, it was the main line of resistance to the Germans in that area. And but anyway, we attacked Gorgolesco coincidentally with the attack on Belvedere. But I tell you, I was never so frightened in all my life.
Talk about the jump off. What were you thinking? What were the people around you thinking?
Well, we jumped off from trucks down on the road, went up a steep draw up toward supposedly up toward the mountains, but you couldn't see anything. It was black as the ace of spades. And occasionally there'd be a distant, well, they used to play searchlights on the cloud deck, and it would give an overall sheen to everything, but you really couldn't make anything out. But we walked up this way for a long time, still no real activity. But then things began to get rough. Shelling began, and none of us knew what to do, make of it. For example, we had never heard a German burp gun go off before, and that was about the most frightening experience you can imagine. Anyway, to go on, we got up quite a ways toward the base of the cone of Gorgolesco, and we had walked for a ways and stopped, walk and stop, walk and stopped. Finally, my squad leader came to me and he said, "All right," he said, "it's up to you, Carl. There's the summit. Go for it." And so as a scout, I was a lead scout, and I started up for it. And the second scout following behind. And I'm going along and at a reasonable pace, firing going on everywhere around me. And I just didn't understand how a man could possibly get through that fire, particularly the mortars and the machine gun fire. And finally, as I was going along, my shoe apparently became untied or loosened. And I looked down, and here was a tripwire going right across my ankles, like that. And as a good scout, I screamed out, "Mine!" and carefully stepped back and then stepped over the thing. But I kept on going, and there were a lot of these mines. And eventually, I decided I had to do something about this. I took my M1 and I shot one of these mines. And I hope it did some good. I think I knocked out 2 of them that way. But then continued on, and all connection with the rest of the outfit I had lost by this time. But the General Hayes, had said to us before we jumped off, he says, "Don't stop for anything. Keep going, keep going." So I just kept going. And I got all the way up to the top of Gorgolesco. Now, I have to be a little bit careful here, because it was the top of Gorgolesco as I knew it. There were other units that were also on Gorgolesco at that time. And I imagine that we all arrived at more or less the same time. But I had to, got up there, I had to wait, 10 minutes or more before any of my guys came up to me. And it was a bad scene.
Did you dig in? Or
What?
you were exposed?
Oh yeah, as soon as you got up the top of that, you started to dig in. But it was, as I found later, it was not easy to dig in a lot of that.
Did you have a trenching tool with you?
Yes, I did.
But it was rock.
It was rock, and I was a shrimp. You know.
The longest 10 minutes of your life?
Please?
Were those the longest 10 minutes of your life?
Well, I had some longer ones coming later. I just couldn't imagine on Gorgolesco how I could possibly survive. Yet at the same time, I had an equally strong feeling that there was no way that I could be killed. I was immortal.
Did you know people who felt that they had a premonition that they were going to be killed?
Oh, absolutely. You know, we had several guys who, even on the boat, the LCIs coming up from Naples to Leghorn, so they just knew they were going to get, and they did.
You're not the first person I've heard say that.
Really?
What do you think that's about? Is that really a premonition, or is that a bad mindset to go into combat with?
I don't know. I think it's a matter of attitude. Believe me, survival didn't come automatically. There were rules that you followed, things that you have been trained to do. One of those things was that every time you stopped, you would dig in. And on the day that we took Della, by actual count, I started 13 slit trenches, because you'd stop and you'd start to dig in. You'd go for 5 minutes, you'd dig in. So it went.
How did the rest of the night go on Gorgolesco?
Well, the night pretty near ended. We got up the top. It was just after dark. I'm sorry, just after daylight. And we were, I don't know whether it was C Company or one of the other companies went through us, but we kept on going down the ridge and laid out a wire, a barbed wire, and dug in. And then around close to the edge of dark, we were ordered to pull out and go back toward the summit of Gorgolesco. And I was absolutely petrified. I was a scout, and on a job like that, the scout had to bring up the rear. And I was the last one through the doggone barbed wire. And I was in such a rush, I caught my pants on the barbed wire, and I didn't know whether I was being pull myself free or not. But it did. Went on, and that night, all I can remember was being cold, and it was shaking all over, partly from the cold, partly from fright, and that persisted till we got right up where we were going to bivouac for the night. I think they brought us some hot food, and we bedded down for the night, but freezing cold. I don't know how cold it was. It couldn't have been all that cold, but it might have been down to freezing or something like that. But boy, combination of this fright, this residual fright, and the cold was just too much.
Did you ever question yourself as to whether you could continue?
No. No, I don't think I ever did.
What happened after that part of, you could see Della from your position?
Yeah, but, well, it's about 2 weeks later that they started off the big push. And our objective was Della. And we, all day long, we hiked up one mountain after another, digging in furiously every time we stopped. And finally, we got up to the point around 5 o'clock at night when we were going to assault Della. We sort of assumed that it would be held strongly by the Germans. Well, as it turned out, because of that, we were going to get artillery support from way back, not just light artillery. We were waiting for the 155s to come in and support us, but they were delayed. And finally, Lieutenant Carcas, who was our company commander by that time, and well, he was our platoon leader, I think, correction, platoon leader, and he says, he told the people that he could not stay on that. We were on a forward slope, and with Della up here, and if we don't get that artillery support now, we're going to go anyway. And but just about this time, the 155s came in, and they just were skimming over our heads. It was just the most frightening thing. Well, at the same time, they gave the word to go, and we started on the run down this face toward Della and then up Della, running pell-mell, screaming at the top of our lungs, screaming all kinds of blasphemous things that we could possibly think of, just to I don't know, as counteract the thing. And we made it to the top of Della without any resistance. And then they said, well, you're going to be counterattacked very soon. You've got to dig in quickly. And I tried to dig in. It's just a solid rock. I couldn't get anywhere. So I went over to Lieutenant Carcas, who was our platoon leader, and I said, look, I can't dig in there. I said, furthermore, it's solid rock. Furthermore, there's a big tree, chestnut tree, right over the position. And I said, I don't want to be there because of tree bursts. The Germans used super quick fuses, and I was surely going to get it. And Lieutenant Kerkis looked at me. He says, "I'm sorry, I got to have a man there." Okay. I guess I mumbled under my, it won't do you any good to have a dead man there. And but he didn't pay any attention to what I said. And a few minutes later, sure enough, tree burst hit, came down, and sprayed me with shrapnel. One piece in particular came through this shoulder, went down inside my chest this way, missed my heart by about an inch, a quarter inch, I think they said, and finally lodged in the lower lobe of my left lung. And I began sucking air. And also it got me in my knee, about 4 pieces of shrapnel in my knee. But anyway, I called for the medic, the usual thing. It was dark by this time, and all hell was beginning to break loose. The Germans had started to overrun the whole position. And I thought we'd have to pull out, but the word was given to hold Della Bay at all cost. Excuse me. But anyhow, the medic that came for me, a guy by the name of...
So let me ask you that question again. When you talked about digging in near a tree, you had no cover over the hole at all, and it wasn't much of a hole.
That's correct. I had no cover at all. And after I was hit, I was just lying out there. And as things, well, I called for the medic, and the medic came over, a guy by the name of Rockefort. I'd followed that man to the ends of the earth. He was a prince of a guy. And I don't understand why he isn't here on this trip. I haven't heard. But anyway, he found that I was bleeding profusely from the chest. And as a story he tells anyway, the only thing he could do was he could wrap up my chest in some raincoat material that he ripped up and so forth. Well, anyway, I was in and out of consciousness. I was really in pretty deep shock. But I'd come to every so often and get some sense of what was going on. And the position was overrun by Germans periodically, and then they'd be beaten off, and then they'd come back. And so it went. Well, I stayed out there all that night. And now, Lieutenant Kerkis says, and it's corroborated by the medic, that Kerkis dragged me over into his hole that he had dug, and sort of covered me with himself that night. I have no recollection of this. I don't doubt but what it's true, but still my recollection is that when I sort of came to in the next morning, I was still out there on top of the ground in about the same position. Well, at this time, a chaplain from the 85th Regiment drove a jeep up through the German lines, up to our position, with 4 litters on it. And the guys, by the name of Elefante was one, and I'm not sure about the other one, probably Delgado was the other one. They said, let's put Miller onto one of those litters. So they hoisted me up onto the litter, and they got 3 other men that were wounded. And the chaplain drove the jeep off through the German lines again, being fired at all the time, and made it to the bottom, and then a short distance up the road to the evacuation hospital.
Just to clarify, they were under fire removing the wounded.
Yeah.
Was that was the normal?
That was pretty much normal there. It had been more normal. It was certainly true there on Della's Bay.
Did the Americans do the same? In terms of the Germans taking their wounded?
Well, I could tell you a story or two on that, but I'd rather not.
So they bring you down on the litter.
Right, and they take us off of the litters and spread us out in the courtyard of what was the MASH type of hospital. And they had put tags on us indicating the severity of our wounds. Well, I guess I had a pretty good tag on, and they soon carried me into the hospital. And again, I was in and out of consciousness. I can't remember it all. And I came to on an operating table, 3 operating tables in a row, and I was the one in the middle. And the guy to my left, they were operating to try to piece together his groin that had been torn apart. And on the other side, sawing off a guy's leg. Anyway, I stayed in the, I should go back. At this point, my mother and father received this telegram. The Secretary of War desires to express his deep regret that your son, PFC Miller Carlton, was seriously wounded in Italy, 06 March. Until new addresses were received, well, so forth and so on. Anyway, that's what my mother and father got. By a few days later, I was strong enough so that I could dictate a letter to a nurse. I don't know whether you want me to read it or not. It's not that important, but it's a short paragraph at the end. It is through the kindness of one of our fine nurses you were receiving this letter. I don't know why this strikes me this way, but I'm always affected the same way by it.
Can you, I don't mean to interrupt, but can you talk a little bit about the medics that you saw in action, helping
The
other
medics?
people, and the attitude of the
Oh, the medics were,
rifle
as
company?
far as I can tell, the medics were super, within the capabilities that existed at that time. It was better than it had been earlier in the war. Remember that penicillin had not been developed until after the North African campaign. As a matter of fact, I make special note of the fact that during the time that I was in the hospital, the evacuation hospital there, and then later in the bigger hospital, I had 168 shots of penicillin. That was a pretty good batch of penicillin. And then they, my chest would fill up with fluid, and they would try to get me to cough. I couldn't cough, it hurt too much. So then the doctors would go in with a little needle, Novocaine, a little bigger needle. Finally they got a big 6-inch one and jam that in and pump out my chest. Well, this was very interesting. There's some good parts of it. They'd have a pretty nurse on this side and a pretty nurse on this side, and you'd have to sit bolt upright on the bed while a doctor went through this process. And if it all went right, it was okay. But one day, he did this, and I instantly passed out. And when he came in the next day, he looked at me, he said, "Sorry, Miller, I hit your diaphragm."
When did you get home?
When did I get home? After they had dropped 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese. It was a very good thing that we did, because we were to be on the landing on Japan, the first attack, first wave. that was what the destiny of the 10th Mountain Division was going to be. And I have that all written out.
How long was the rehabilitation?
Please?
How long was your rehabilitation?
At home?
Yeah.
Oh, I was more or less normal right from the start. I had no serious trauma.
One of my favorite quotes of yours is about is the one that I told you before about even the Army couldn't kill your love for the mountains.
Yeah.
So to talk a little bit about once you got home, just to round things out, what life was
Well,
like.
you see, I got back in January, and the dates bother me. I can't come up with it. But anyway, I couldn't start college at that time, in February. And furthermore, I thought it'd be kind of fun to spend the rest of the winter skiing. And so I spent a good deal of time that winter back on the skis again. And it was pretty interesting. By this time, I had become interested to some extent in girls, though not my wife to be. And
how long did it take you to get back into a civilian mindset? Because we've heard so much since the Vietnam era about readjustment phases. What was yours like?
I would tend to minimize that. Whatever problems of that sort that I had, were probably of my own making. Although I had been a reasonably good student,